All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the old habits. Welcome to the Soil Health Nexus Digital Cafe. Excited for you to join us today. For those of you who are new to the Soil Health Nexus, we are a soil health dedicated team that's led by University Extension in the 12 North Central states. And we work to increase the access to research-based soil health knowledge, extension, and resources. You can see our website there where we have the recordings of these digital cafes. We also include the Soil Health Toolbox in there, which is a suite of soil health resources, as well as publications, etc. Videos, you name it. It's chock full with soil health resources. So a little bit about our series today. We are going to have a presentation from Ross Evelsizer. Sorry, Ross. Ross is going to be talking about the economics of relay cropping. He's with the Natural Resources, the Northeast Iowa Resource Conservation and Development, and he's the Natural Resource Project Director there. Then following his presentation, we're going to have Q&A, so make sure to submit your questions for Ross in the chat. And then after the Q&A, we will break out into breakout rooms. So we have breakout rooms for researchers, educators, agency staff, farmers, and students. You can pick the breakout room that's going to work out best for you. And we can discuss the presentation, the research, how it has implications for our work, as well as discuss any other topics that are on folks' minds today related to soil health. Right. So before we will go ahead and stop sharing then and hand it over to Ross. Ross, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing a little bit of your research with us.
Good. Thank you for having me. Everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay. Yeah, my name's Ross Evelsizer. I've been with Northeast Iowa Resource Conservation Development. Everybody just calls it RC&D. It's much easier. I've been here almost 11 years now. And just a quick background on our organization. We work on all sorts of projects, natural resources based, but also small business development, local foods, tourism, and a variety of other things. So we kind of cover a lot of different bases. And we have a relatively small staff, so we get to do a variety of things, but they all kind of eventually tie together. So, my primary, there we go. My primary focus, I guess, how I got into this is basically from this picture right here. So I was hired originally to start working with a group called the Turkey River Watershed Management Authority on a plan to reduce flooding and improve water quality in that watershed. And that's because, this is what it looks like when it rains in Iowa. Every stream or river essentially kind of looks the same. And as you can see there, that's poor water quality, and there's a lot of soil that's being transported by that water. And so this is not this has been an ongoing thing. So the map in front of you shows FEMA-related flood disaster declarations over a 30-year period. And Iowa had some of the most frequent recurrences of that. Other areas that jump out are areas that are impacted by hurricanes, or Grand Forks. So we're talking about, we're on par with some of the worst, most frequently devastated areas in the country. And so you start looking at why that is, and you start looking for solutions. Kind of to compress that, we really started looking at solutions that were landscape-based. We developed a watershed plan for the Turkey River, and we've developed several since then. And really what it comes down to is, how can we affect the most acres to make an impact? And we looked at things like, infield, edge of field practices, farm ponds, detention basins, even buffer strips, things like that. And those are all very good practices. Great to see those on the landscape. But it was never really feasible to scale that up. And so we started looking at alternative solutions in the field where we could improve the soil health over a number of acres without it costing a lot of money. And that's where we developed this project called MultiCropping Iowa. And essentially that kind of formed out of a relationship with a local producer. Lauren Steinlage happens to farm in West Union, Iowa, which is about 20 miles from our office. And he's the first person that I encountered that was doing relay cropping. And it made a lot of sense, but it seemed kind of crazy. It was hard enough to get people to do cover crops and no-till, let alone to do something as far out as relay cropping. Until we started talking about, the discussion with him was when he started talking about how it pencils out in terms of a budget. And that's kind of when it clicked. And from there, we've kind of built this project up and done trials and tried to see where it goes. So just some quick definitions. We're looking at multi-cropping as a form of regenerative agriculture. Certainly you could do this as non-regenerative agriculture, but obviously the way that we want to promote it and see it happen is as a form of regenerative agriculture. And I put the definition there as a system of farming that increases biodiversity and it enhances ecosystems, because there was a lot of definitions of regenerative agriculture. I'm not saying that this is the only one or the correct one, but that's kind of the viewpoint that we're looking at. And also, essentially what we're talking about with the overall term of multi-cropping is that you're talking about more than one crop harvested from the same field in the same year, which for us northern folks is fairly unusual, right? So we have a short growing season, so to be able to do that takes some coordination. So there's actually quite a few different kinds of multi-cropping. The most common and what we've been working with the most is relay cropping, and that's essentially where you have two or more crops and they overlap. Their growing seasons overlap in that field and planted and harvested at different times. There's also double cropping where and that can have actually two different definitions. You have two crops that are grown and harvested at the same times, or you can actually have crops that are grown back to back. So if you took an oat crop off and then planted a late season soybean after the oats came off, that would actually be considered double cropping. Polycropping, which is three or more crops, and then intercropping. So essentially all of these would fall under that title of multi-cropping. So one of the things that, just to go along with this is we looked at, we wanted to demonstrate this practice in the field and measure this as it goes along and measure the impacts of it. So along with the economics and of it for the producer, we've been looking at actually how this impacts the soil, how it impacts the potential, the whole water system within a watershed. And so the pictures here are showing two hydro stations. One is in a relay cropping field, and then right across the road on more of a conventional field to track how, when it rains, how that water, how much falls on that. So that collects precipitation, but also how that water moves through the system, how quickly it moves into the soil. And then we can use those results using a model, hydrologic model, and take that to the watershed level and say, if we were to convert all of these acres over to this practice or something similar, we could have this impact on the hydrologic situations when we get large rain events. So that's kind of what we've been working on along with the actual practice itself. So we want to keep doing that. We've deployed actually 4 of those hydro stations. We have 2 different sites. We want to continue to do that as we move forward, so that we continue to understand the capability of this as a conservation practice and how it can be used on the landscape to affect flooding. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the practice itself. So, we have done over 30 trials at this point that have been completed. And the first few trials that we did were completely voluntary. We simply offered some soil sampling along with it. And since then, we've been trying to actually look at more structured replicated strip trials, and we actually were able to find funding from a few different sources to provide the producers with incentives to spray those out. And so we were paying for the $40 an acre in most cases for the trials to have a replicated strip in there with just plain monocrop soybeans, and then also the relays right next to it, as you can see from the pictures. We've done trials all over Iowa for the most part. I would say those are mostly focused on the eastern side of the state. So if you're familiar with Iowa, it's kind of split in half east to west by Interstate 35. And most of those trials have been on the eastern side of the state, but all the way from the Minnesota border down to southern Iowa. So we've covered a number of different landscapes and a little bit different climates. And that definitely has played into the results to a point, but I would say it's worked everywhere that we've done it. So that's been good. Of the relay trials that we've completed, we gave quite a bit of leeway on what the farmers wanted to do. Essentially, we wanted to do relays. Most of them gravitated towards winter wheat or cereal rye. I would say we've actually had less than, I think there's only been 4 trials total that use winter wheat. Otherwise, we've had most of them use cereal rye. And a lot of them are coming into it from the standpoint that they're familiar with cereal rye from cover cropping or growing it as a grain themselves. So it was a pretty easy step for them to take this to a relay situation, because all of them had played around with cereal rye as a cover crop prior to that. So that becomes the natural kind of gravitation. So again, with the trials, what we really saw was that cereal rye and soybeans worked really, really well. Part of the reason for that is cereal rye gets pretty tall, and you're harvesting that in July, late July, early August. Most of them are harvesting in July, and so the beans are up. Obviously, as you can see here, they're up and present. And so the cereal rye being taller gives a little bit more cushion for the rye to be harvested off the beans without damaging the beans. So the combine's able to go right over the beans without clipping them. It's okay to beat around beans a little bit. They're pretty tolerant to that, but definitely don't want to be clipping them off and damaging them that way. A lot of the cereal rye most of it is drilled in the fall. I don't think we had any trials where people were trying to do actually a full relay trial with an aerial seeded rye, but I definitely wouldn't recommend it. And what we found over that time is that the rye drilled earlier, obviously it's going to give it a better start. If we can get out of the ground and vernalize in the fall, that's a much better. So we definitely had trials that rye wasn't seeded till late October, even November in some cases, and the stand looks much better if it's seeded early in the fall. A couple of other things that have come to fruition that have been pretty common themes, and some of them not very predictable. So, like for instance, you'd think like a soybean planted later would be better, but in actuality, a lot of producers have luck planting a longer season bean, like a full season longer than they would normally use, and planting that earlier. I think the earliest date, we actually had a trial in north central Iowa where those soybeans were planted on April 8th, that's extremely early especially for northern Iowa. The way that's laid out, a lot of them are using two twin rows of the cereal grain, and then those are usually spaced about 8 to 10 inches, and then in between that, then they leave a gap, and then the beans are on 30-inch rows between that. So, and like I said, a lot of the harvest for the cereal grain is in July. Some of that trickles into August, and most of that's done. A lot of producers didn't have access to specialized equipment, and so they were just using a platform head to take that off and keeping it up higher. There was a couple of producers that used a row crop head that was specifically adapted for this practice, and that was much more efficient in the harvest. So the first question we get all the time is, what were the yields? And so that kind of is reflected here in the graph. we definitely, so the gray on the far right is the mono soybean yield in the same fields as we had relay soybeans and cereal rye. And so a lot of times we were right around 30, it was a pretty tight, tight band, right around 30 bushels an acre for yield for the cereal rye. And then as you can see there, a lot of times the relay soybeans had a little bit of a yield drag in the relay setup versus a monocrop soybean. And I think the average was like 12 and a half bushels per acre over all the trials, if you take the average. This is kind of a little bit more telling about the results, though. So this is net revenue. So we took all of the costs and we tried to do actual costs for each producer. So we'd send them a spreadsheet and have them put in everything from labor to land costs to their seed and everything else, versus using university averages. We did do that if we weren't able to get it from the producer, but for the most part, we were able to use actual figures for most of these trials to look at net revenue. And then we looked at what the actual value, what they were able to sell their cereal rye and soybeans for. Some of them used the cereal rye for their own reseeding for cover crops. So then it was an estimated value. But as you can see here, the relays had a net revenue that was significantly higher than the monocrop soybeans. And that was for a number of reasons. One is you're taking two crops off, so you have two things of value. We started these trials in 2018. Over that time, we saw a big dip in soybean prices, and cereal rye was kind of at a pretty good price. And at some times we were seeing cereal rye that was almost worth as much as the soybeans. And in that case, you could take those 30 bushel an acre of cereal rye and simply add that to your soybean yield in terms of value. And because of that, that more than exceeded the yield loss that you would see from doing the relays between the bean setup. So by the numbers, it came out to across all of our trials, you take everything at the end of the day, and it was $50.90 per acre. That was net profit higher for relay soybeans and cereal rye than monocrop beans. Where we had a pretty wide spread on that, and the farmers that were able to nearly match their soybean yields obviously saw a much higher profit margin, because they weren't losing any profit from decreased yields, and they were able to simply add that cereal rye yield to their profits. The other place that we saw producers make savings was actually by reducing their inputs. Cereal rye is a natural weed suppressant, and so they were able to. I mean, we had some farmers that actually just went completely cold turkey, and they just literally were planting seed and harvesting, and there was no application of fungicide, herbicide, pesticide on those fields, and they came out really well, especially in terms of profit. Now their yields didn't blow anybody away, but their profits were very high because they didn't have any costs into it. Where we've seen problems, particularly the last 3 seasons, is areas of drought, and it's not universally drought. It's drought at a specific time, and it's usually for us late May into June, when those soybeans are just coming up and the cereal rye is really taking off. And if we're dry during that time, the rye can take up so much moisture that it can really hurt the beans. And in some cases, we've seen that even the beans look terrible because it was dry during that time. But then we got moisture after that in late July and August. Those beans still recovered. But like this past year, we didn't have moisture in May and June. We didn't have moisture in July and August. It was just a dry year. And so we don't have those results yet, but it may be pretty ugly in terms of how the relays come out. I will say in all of the trials that we've done, 0 of them came out negative in terms of net profit. There were times where the monocrop beans outperformed the relay crops in terms of profit, but none of the relay cropping trials came out where the producer actually lost money on those acres. The other thing to consider is that we are now back kind of, I don't know if normal is the right way to put it, but probably a more typical price on the soybeans. So we're seeing that higher soybean price definitely increases the profit gap with those 12, with that average of 12.5 bushels per acre of yield loss in the relay. So definitely want to close that up as we move forward. Some other things that we've done along with this is looking at the actual soil health with it. So this was put together by Luther College, where we did some soil sampling in conventional fields, cover crop no-till fields, relay fields, and then also perennial situations with actually a long-term forest and a long-term tallgrass prairie, and looking at aggregate stability. Just here, you can see there's obviously a difference. There's not a huge difference between cover crops and no-till and relays, but there is a big difference between those two practices and conventional. And those two practices are also approaching the point where you're, getting good soil structure, even when compared to, a place like tallgrass prairie, where you think of that's the best possible scenario for soil structure, right? So to be able to do that in a place where you're taking a higher profit per acre, that comes out pretty well for the producer. This is kind of a crazy graph, but essentially what we're showing here is back to that flood modeling, and this is initial results. So we definitely have to be a little bit careful on interpretation. But what we're actually able to see with the circles is that in years where we have floods that occur, these are the reduction of annual peaks at the watershed level using the data that we collected off of our plots. In terms of, and this is an increase simply because of the increase in evapotranspiration by having 2 crops out there instead of just 1, we're able to show a fairly significant reduction in peak flows at the watershed level using these regenerative practices, which is it's very encouraging, but definitely take this with a grain of salt as we move. We got to get more data before we really put this out there in terms of this is how much we could reduce flooding. But so far what we're seeing is that it could be a really powerful tool. So other things that we've seen that we definitely want to look into more that could end up paying the producer back in the long run is several producers noticed that do a lot of their own soil sampling, is that they looked at that, this is part of the rotation. So a lot of times producers that was doing relay cropping, in the first year would follow it with corn. And what they were noticing is after following relays, they were looking at a much higher available nitrogen level going into corn, which translates for them because they're using that number to determine what their application rate of nitrogen is going to be for corn. That translated into direct savings. And it was very, very significant. And so we haven't researched that at all. That's simply a field observation, but it's definitely something that, we've seen it enough that I think it's definitely worth investigation. It could be an added benefit. I mentioned the weed suppression. Like I said, we've seen it time and time again. Producers just don't need to. There's just not really a need for herbicides in the system because the cereal rye is such a good weed suppressor on its own. If you think about, I'm sure most of the people that are part of this group recognize the fact that we get weeds because that's Mother Nature's way of trying to cover up bare soil. And if you don't give it a place to grow because you have something there, then the weeds aren't going to come near as badly. And so this is a really good way to have something growing there 365 days and be present. So the other thing that we've seen that translates directly to is it works well in an organic system. One of the knocks on organic production is obviously the tillage that comes along with it, and usually that's for weed suppression. So we have had producers trying it for transitioning to organic with quite a bit of success. And I think probably one of my biggest takeaways is that we started on a lot of times anywhere from 10 to 40 acre trials when we did these trials. And a lot of the producers that participated in the trials, whether voluntarily or through an incentive, this was their first time doing relays. They'd never done it before. And almost all of those producers that did a trial through that, they may still have a trial with it, but they've expanded their acres on their own. In some cases, by adding a couple of 100 acres to their trials. And to me, that's one of the best data points that this is a practice that works. It works for the producer and it works for soil health, and it's definitely something we want to keep pursuing. That doesn't mean we have it perfect. So there's a lot of questions that are left. Essentially, what we want to look at: how do we optimize the system? How do we close that yield gap? How do we there's so many varieties of that we could look at together beyond just cereal rye and soybeans. There's almost there's very, very little research into optimizing cereal grain production that could work along with this. So we have a long ways to go to optimize the system. The other problem that we have is it's very easy to grow and sell corn and soybeans in Iowa. It is not easy to grow and sell a bit and sell virtually anything else. And so if you want to market a secondary crop like a cereal rye, some producers are fortunate they have something close. I'm from Northeast Iowa near Decorah. Somebody wants to grow a cereal grain here, they probably have to truck it 2 to 2.5 hours to sell it. That cuts into your profit margins pretty quickly. So we definitely need to be looking into that. Insurability. If you follow crop insurance news across the country, actually relay cropping became an insurable practice, or at least the soybeans within that. An insurable practice just in the last couple of years, and they're actually using data from our trials to help set that up. And so that's been really cool to see that's become a reality, but still ways to go in terms of making that a little bit easier. Equipment, that's a huge question that we get. I didn't really touch on that too much. At this point, there's not equipment that's built specifically for this practice. Everything is either custom built or people just kind of doing as is, as they can use what they have, and that has worked. But again, getting back to that first point of how do we optimize the system, we have better equipment. This it would go much better. And then again, looking at different varieties, there's so many other crops we could grow besides just adding one crop. But this is a step in the right direction. So I'll probably wrap it up right there in terms of the presentation. We have received funding from a number of different places and have a number of different partners that have been crucial in making this project happen. I'm not an ag expert, so we've leaned heavily on the Iowa Soybean Association to help lay out these trials and things like that. So definitely appreciative to our funders and partners and all the people that have participated, especially the farmers that have really helped drive this along. Possible. So I'll stop sharing probably, and then I can't see the questions. Oh, maybe I can. I can see it. So do you want me to leave my screen up or?
Sure. Yeah, feel free to leave your screen up. I do see some questions here for you. So let's see. Could you talk a bit more about Dr. Erin Sylvia in Wisconsin and her research on roller crimping rye as mulch for soybeans? Are you familiar with that research by chance?
A little bit. Yeah, there's a lot of that's a popular conversation, and it's certainly a good thing. Anytime you're able to plant green and have that green, that green plant out there. That's the biggest thing, right? Is having something growing out there year round, starting in the fall. And, you know, I know Erin's been working on that a lot. I've had a couple of conversations with her. And, you know, the diverse cover crop thing is such a, it's a great topic, and it's part of this. You know, I view relay crops as part of that bigger regenerative system. I kind of scrolling through the chat here, somebody mentioned Rick Clark. Absolutely, like what Rick Clark is doing in Indiana, and a lot of the producers that are doing this have started out, they transitioned, they were probably conventional at one time, and they went to no-till and added the cover crops, and then they started thinking about, like, how can I make money off of these cover crops, right? Like, as beneficial as cover crops are, they're still an expense. And so in this case, people are able to actually make money and get the benefits of cover crops at the same time. It's never going to cover every acre of every farm, but it's another tool in the toolbox, and definitely something that we can learn from that one.
Absolutely. Jonathan Pruitt is curious, have you calculated the land equivalent ratio for relay cropping cereals with soybeans?
We've not done that. Definitely would be interested in talking more about that, but no, I have not. We have not done that.
Okay. Matt is curious, he missed the first part of your presentation. Where were these producers located? Maybe for anyone who joined late.
Yeah, so we have, our trials have been almost all in Iowa and primarily focused on the eastern half of the state. We do have several, I know people that are relay cropping west on the western part of the state, and we do have a couple of trials in the southwest Iowa, down around Guthrie Center. So that being said, that's just the ones we've met. That's just who we worked with directly, and that was primarily controlled by funding. I know of people, and, you know, I learned about this practice from Lauren Steinlage, who learned about it from, you know, people in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and other locations. So, I mean, there are people anywhere that are growing crops that are doing something like this. And it's, you know, to that point, on our social media, we have people following us from everywhere, from every continent where people reside and grow crops. They're looking at this in Brazil and Argentina. We've been contacted by them. There's another research group that is starting to look into this in Germany. So in a lot of places, this is happening in different parts of the globe for different reasons. But this is definitely something that, you know, people are looking at all over.
Yeah, absolutely. I know soil health has been getting interest throughout the world. Trent has more of a comment noting that he planted green into cereal rye this past year and didn't kill the rye soon enough, and the rye sucked the moisture out of the soil, so the soybeans couldn't sprout.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it was a drought year. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah.
This last year was just tough.
Yeah.
It wasn't good for monocrops in a lot of situations either. So, you know, what I would say to that is, you know, when you look at our rainfall averages, at least in Iowa, you know, this covers a lot bigger area than just Iowa, but, you know, we have a drought about once every 10 years. When we get them, it's not good, but I would say most of the time we are dealing with excess moisture versus not enough. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that drought conditions were true across the region and certainly hurt with covers.
Rebecca, I would say stay with it, Trent. That was
yeah, right.
Stay with it. Don't be one and done. It does work, but yeah, this last year.
Yeah, looking at the short term. Rebecca is curious, what cereal rye markets are your farmers selling into beyond cover crop seed?
What I tell people to start with is, you know, when I'm talking to farmers, that's a lot of times the first question. Where the heck do I sell this stuff? But like I said, a lot of folks that are interested in this are already doing cover crops. And so what I tell people is first be your own market. Look at this as growing your own seed and then returning that. I mean, you can grow enough. That's how Lauren Steinmeier started doing it. relays on like 30 acres, and that was to, you know, spread over like 7, 8, 900 acres, and then he reseeded all that, and then he still had more. So then he sold it to a neighbor, and then that's when he started thinking like, jeepers, that worked out pretty well. So I always tell people, be your own market to start with. Grow a little bit, use it for your own seed as a way to reduce your costs, to do cover crops and be regenerative on your farm. From there, you know, I think the lowest hanging fruit is cover crop acres. It's the least restrictive, and simply you're pretty much just hoping for a seed that germinates, which is pretty easy to do. A lot of times with cereals, a lot of that rye that's wasted because you're keeping the combine up regrows in that field, so you're already seeding there. And then from there, that's where we're really starting to look at like, how do we expand the markets from there? So looking at growing food grade grains, even companies like GM and things like that are starting to look more at regenerative as the future for their consumers. And so food grade small grains are definitely a possibility. The other big one, particularly in Iowa, obviously we're a huge pork state through confined feeding operations, and that's primarily driven by corn production. If we could get 20% of the grain production that is right now corn switched over to cereal grain that goes towards swine feed, that would put a lot more roots in the soil over a lot of acres in the state. If we could just tap into that little bit. And there's plenty of research out there that shows that cereal grains, particularly cereal rye, is a good livestock feed. So it would say, I don't know if that's a simple solution, but it would definitely move a lot. It would definitely drive a pretty big market. So, and I always tell people, drink more beers. You can use some beer production as well. We've done some promotional stuff, and there's been some regenerative beers that have been produced around, but unfortunately, it doesn't take a lot of grain to make a lot of beer. So we're not going to drive big change, but it's a lot more fun to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at the other side of the coin, folks are curious about incentives. Mary Beth is curious, could you expand on the amounts of the incentives and the most common source of those funds?
Yeah, so all of our funding has come primarily through the funders that you see listed here on my last slide. What was interesting about this project is that we were more or less providing the incentive, and we usually, paid something like that on like $40 an acre or something like that. That was a pretty easy number, and it was compared to other trial programs that Iowa Soybean Association had done. What was interesting is that a lot of times the producers were using that, especially after they'd had a year or two of experience, but they were using that through, because we had to actually spray out the relays to get the monocrop bean acres. And we had producers that actually pulled out of the trial because their cereal rye looked so good they didn't want to spray out the strips. And so, yeah, that's fine. You don't have to finish it out. So I think that was one of the biggest things, is that we were almost compensating because they were going to make less money by having to spray the strips out. So I thought that was an interesting point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt's curious, you said producers planted later maturity soybeans than normal. How much later?
So the general rule of thumb that most people have been kind of following is a whole season. So for example, if you would typically plant a 2.8 bean, then they would go to a 3.8. We have some producers that are pushing that even further, trying to up those bean yields. That's a risky proposition. We had a farmer last year that got pinched with that because his soybeans were still green, and he said he was gonna probably have the highest yielding beans he's ever had, but they were still green, and it got frosted in September. So Yeah, there's there's a risk there on the end of it, and like I said, if it's pushing that earlier, we getting those beans in the ground earlier, obviously there's a risk. We've had some interesting results with frost and freezing on the front end as well. The good news there is that the cereal rye has, in most cases, protected the beans if they happen. So we had maybe 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, we had a May 28th or 31st really hard frost, and the cereal rye actually protected those beans because they were well up at that point. But the cereal rye was able to provide enough of a blanket, basically, that those things go off.
All right, I see another question here. Sorry, I do have a train in the background, so I'm hoping you can hear me. There's always harvest lost when combining crops. Was there enough volunteer rye left on the ground to be a cover crop after the soybean harvest?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. We definitely saw a lot of that, and this is no different. There's always waste grain. Most of the, I didn't really get into it too much because it's still, we haven't done very many trials this way, but I should have mentioned that most of the folks that have done trial with cereal rye are using open pollinated BNS rye, so variety not stated, so it's nothing special. It can be pretty inconsistent height wise, and then most of the guys that are doing this are adding that rye crop to their beans. So the beans is still the primary focus of their crop. So they want to make sure that they don't damage those. So they're keeping the head higher, and you have different stalk heights or different head heights, I should say, with the open pollinated rye. And so there's a lot of loss. And yeah, most of the if you just let it go after that, a lot of times you're getting a cover crop. By the time those beans come off, there's already a nice green layer that's coming up underneath there. We did do 3 trials with hybrid rye using KWS seed, and that meant that provided a much more consistent rye stand. So a little bit shorter, but not much, but it was much more consistent, and so I think the harvest on that would provide much less waste, and the yields were much higher. So we saw actually, one producer averaged 98 bushels an acre on the rye with the hybrid rye. So there's a serious potential there in terms of marketing, but that's the challenge with hybrid rye is not marketable as a cover crop, or you can't really grow it because of the patent on the seed, and it's not bred that way. So there's back to the marketability question. We gotta use that in something else besides cover crop seeds. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ross. I was just looking through. I know I do see more comments in the chat, and certainly some folks have shared some webinars and good resources. So be sure to look those out and check them out. So I think those are all the questions. I have just opened out the breakout rooms for everyone. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see the different breakout rooms. We have educator room, researcher, agency, student, and farmer. So feel free to choose the room that makes the most sense for you and join, and we can have those breakout conversations to discuss a little bit more about your research, Ross, and how it could be utilized, how we might share this work with some of the folks we're working with, its implications, as well as other topics that come to mind that are soil health related. So feel free to take a moment and join those. Ross, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. If you're able to stick around and join a breakout room, I'm sure folks would love to continue the conversation, but we really appreciate you sharing.
Sure, yeah, I might jump into one.